Good evening everyone and Happy New Year. Today the 1st of January 2013 and welcome to an Oz Cyclone Chasers update, as tonight we talk about Tropical Cyclone Freda, its future. We talk about the Northwest Kimberley / Northern Territory and the potential low that might form there. We talk about MJOs and monsoons and all sorts of rainfall producing things over the next 20 to 30 minutes. On the video timeline at the bottom, you can see exactly what part of the video we're talking about, what particular item. So if 30 minutes is too long for you, please fast forward to the bit that you want to see. And remember, at any point, if you wish to support us financially, you can always just click on an ad that appears in the video. It's free to do that. It takes 2 seconds of your time and helps us to pay for our chasers. Alright, let's get into it. The latest official information from the Fiji Met Bureau puts Tropical Cyclone Freda at a Category 2 system, pushing to the southeast and eventually stalling off or near the New Caledonian coastline, or near the island, whether it's the east coast or the west coast, not quite sure yet, depends on the model, but stalling there in a couple of days' time and eventually expecting it to push back to the west if it survives. The Joint Typhoon Warning Centre believe this very similar type of track, very similar types of intensities, probably a little bit overestimated the intensity at the start of their forecast at around about lunchtime today, but very similar type of track, except they go a little bit further into the future and they predict that sharp recurvature back to the west towards the Australian area of responsibility and continue to maintain the system with winds to 35 knots. Gusting to 45, so a marginal tropical cyclone by our standards. So that's a little bit further into the future using the JTWC track. If we take a look at how Tropical Cyclone Freda has gone through the day, you can see that the bulk of its convection is well and truly away from its center. It's still trying to develop convection in here, but it's still being sheared away to the southeast. So you can see here in this image a couple of hours ago or 4 hours ago, it was really trying hard to kick in a little bit of new thunderstorm activity near its center, but is really struggling because it keeps getting pushed away to the southeast, away from the middle of the system, and that makes it very difficult for the cyclone to intensify. The latest microwave imagery, I'm sorry we can't blow this up for you with a bit of higher resolution, but we can see here that the center of the system is right there according to our microwave. We can see the spiral banding coming in through here of the lower cloud, and we can see some very strong storm activity out to the east-southeast of the actual center of the system. So this is the actual, if you like, an eye of the system, or the low-level circulation center. This is where the strongest actual thunderstorms are, so well away to the east of the actual center of the system. You can really see that clearly if we look at this particular image where we've got the spiral banding coming in, but we've got pretty well an exposed low-level circulation center in here with a number of, or basically all its strong convection out in this region out here. So this is where all its really heavy thunderstorm, strongest winds are. This is the actual middle of the cyclone. So you can see that the microwave probably shows it up a little better than this, but even with the visible imagery we can see that it's exposed its low-level circulation center. We can still see it's trying its best to maintain some type of structure, at least in the lower to mid-levels, and so for that it's got to be commended, because it is trying hard to stay structurally sound even though all of its tall and strong thunderstorms are getting whisked away out here to the southeast. Once again, you can clearly see here, this is our low-level circulation center. This is a little bit earlier in the day. You can clearly see all the really strong storm activity out to the east-southeast, and the reason that is because we've got these very strong winds in the upper levels of the atmosphere that continue to push all of the developing storms that try to form around the eye or around the center, and they push them quickly out to the southeast, and because of that we can't seem to develop all that strong convection around the actual circulation center. Because the system is struggling so much in terms of its convection and its actual movement, because parts of it wanting to push southeast, the other part wants to push west, and it's really battling within itself, it's sort of being stuck in this area now for at least about 12 to 18 hours. And what we're starting to see this patch of green right here in the middle of that yellow, this little patch of green right in there. Now that little patch of green is what we call a bit of cold water upwelling swirling that happens when we have a system or a cyclone that just sits there and churns up the water. It churns up water underneath the surface, which is a little bit cooler, and brings it up to the surface. And we're just starting to see a little bit of evidence of that on the sea surface temperature map of today. And we'll probably start to see a little bit more of that creep in as long as the system remains fairly slow moving. For those that don't know, tropical cyclones require green or better in terms of sea surface temperatures for them to continue to gain energy from the surface. Once they get into the blue, which is under 26 degrees Celsius, they can't get enough energy to sustain their warm core. Okay, so to look at why it's weakening, we've pretty well gone over it, but here's the official look at the actual wind shear levels and wind shear values. It's at the moment between 20 and 30 knots, so it's in an area of reasonable wind shear, and we can see that the wind shear travels in this direction and then travels out to the northeast. But where the system is right now, it's being sheared almost directly east, so the storms are developing near the center and then quickly being pushed away from the center by the wind shear at 20 to 30 knots. So if we start to track where it's expected to go in its forecast, you can see here it's really not going into a much better area. In fact, it's going into a much worse area as it travels over the next 3 days. You're talking getting to levels of up to 40 knots of wind shear. So there's a huge doubt as to whether this system can survive. Now, if it survives, we start talking a recurve back to the west. If it survives, and this is the key thing, it's a big if. There's, for instance, out of the 100 odd model runs from this morning that have been run, only about 65 or 70 believe that it's going to survive. The other 30 believe it's going to die sometime in the next 2 to 3 days. If it dies, everything we talk about from now until the end of talking about Freda is completely immaterial, because it just won't happen. If it can somehow maintain what it's trying to do right now and maintain its structure in the low levels, then we start looking at a potential cyclone threat on the Queensland coast, or at least in the Coral Sea. But it's still a big if, and I need to get you to understand that if you're watching this tonight, that it is a huge if, and there's only about 30 of the models that suggest it won't do that. It won't be able to survive. And look, to be honest, there's not many systems that can survive 30, 40 plus knots of wind shear for any length of time whatsoever, and this is already a fairly weak system, so we've got to take that into account. Okay, so these are the steering levels. Now, there's a lot happening in this diagram, so don't get too bogged down. Watch where the arrows are going here. So, at the moment, Freda is going to be steered in that direction, because have a look at these lines here. These streamlines are pushing in that direction. Now, this is the deep layer mean from about, or this is basically the winds from about 6 kilometers up in the atmosphere all the way down to about 1 kilometer up in the atmosphere, and we basically just look at them and we weigh them up in terms of their density and how much they're going to impact the actual direction of this system based on that. So at the moment, we're expecting Freda to go southeast. Now, what we're also expecting is this big high. Look at how strong this big high near Adelaide is. It's going to push in this direction here. So it's going to fill in this little gap. See this gap between this high and this high is going to be filled in, all right, by more ridging. And so what that's going to do is it's going to cause Freda to round and then push in that direction. As the high rebuilds, it should push west to west-northwest. Now, if the high is very strong in here when it comes into this region, if the high becomes very strong, as some models are predicting, Freda will actually push to the west-northwest, not directly west or southwest. If the high is very weak, Freda will push southwest, or whatever's left of Freda will push southwest. If the high is of moderate intensity and really fills in this gap, the cyclone, or whatever's left of it, should push to the west and eventually becomes a bit more of a threat for southern and south central Queensland. If it pushes more to the west-northwest, it becomes a bit more of a threat eventually in the long term for central Queensland and even parts of the tropical coast. But there's a lot of factors still in play here, and as I say, we always go back to the but and if. The but is, and the if is, that still out of the 100 models surveyed at 10 a.m. this morning, only 70 of them have it surviving. 30 of them have it dying. Now, if it dies, anything that happens here, completely immaterial, it's all rubbish. So that's something we always have to go back to. This graphic I'm showing you is a little bit of interest only and should be taken with a massive grain of salt. It looks at the maximum potential intensity of a tropical system. Now, this is if everything, absolutely everything, and I mean absolutely everything, can go right for this system. This is the maximum intensity it can achieve. So, the real world, this never happens. But it at least gives us an idea, will the ocean be hot enough, or will it have enough oceanic heat to allow it to continue to be a tropical cyclone as it pushes to the west or west-northwest? Now, the deal here is basically anywhere sort of north of this 1,000 line has enough potential if everything else is perfect. But really, realistically, for it to be a tropical cyclone as it hits the coast, we're really trying to look for this 980 line, which is just around here where my cursor is. So it really needs to stay north of that line, because at any point there's always going to be something working against the system throughout its track to the west. So we do need to give ourselves a little bit of leeway there and understand that we can't just use the worst case scenario. So basically, for this to be a tropical cyclone as it approaches land, assuming that the atmosphere is perfect or very close to it, and it won't be, but assuming that it is, you're probably going to want it, it needs to sort of hit north of this particular area of the coastline. So at this stage, you'd never say Brisbane's safe, but you wouldn't put them in completely in the firing line of a strong tropical cyclone, just because the maximum potential intensity suggests that no matter, even if the atmosphere is perfect on its approach, it's still unlikely to get too far below 990 if it hits southeast Queensland. So it's nothing to be alarmed about, but it is just something we do need to talk about now, is its future movement. Alright, here we go. This is an overlay of the dynamical modelling over the next 5 days and what it suggests there's going to happen. Now, all of these models were taken at 10 a.m. this morning. That's the closest we've got to this video. GFS is the red line. GFS has been very insistent on southeast. Even up until this morning, it had it drifting towards New Zealand. It's now figured out that the thing's been sheared too much, and it can no longer be steered towards New Zealand. Like we said last night in our video when we went through all the steering patterns, and we said that this New Zealand option was really out, and the fact that the model was still suggesting it meant that it was wrong. And we're seeing that now, and we're seeing the model correcting itself, and it's pushed the system out to the west in the long term. All the models are pretty well doing a very similar thing, just at different rates. The UK Met model, the second most accurate, we've said has really struggled with this tropical cyclone, but you can see even the UK Met model has it pushing to the west a little bit further, or a fair bit further north than the GFS. The CMC splits the difference. The Canadian model splits the difference, pushes it southwest, then southeast, and then a quick recurve back to the west and even west-northwest. And the No-Gaps model pushes the system out to the southeast, then south, and then curves it back to the west, a lot further south than the other three dynamical models. Okay, so if we take a look at the UK Met ensemble, and we can see still a lot of divergence in this model. There's still a lot of model members that keep pushing it well east before eventually recurving it. Some of them don't even have it recurving, so we've still got a lot of model disagreement. Now, out of this model, 71% of the model members find the system at the end of 5 days. 29% have already had it weakened to nothing. So, and that's something we always need to go back to tonight, is there's still only about a 70% chance of this thing being able to withstand the volatile nature of the atmosphere in the next 2 days in that area. After that, conditions definitely do improve, and we can see here the ones that do push west suggest that it's going to find a pretty decent region of low wind shear. But once we look at the longer term, we're going to show you that the actual humidity levels of the atmosphere become a bit of an issue as well. There's a fair bit of dry air out here in the Western Coral Sea that could impact the system on its approach to the coast, or as it approaches westwards, at least over the Coral Sea. But overall, the model is now starting to come on board with a westerly movement in most of its members, after a southeast shift and then a westerly movement. And at the moment, it's predicting this central part of Queensland a little bit in the firing line. But as I say, remember, come back to this here, only 70% of the model members even suggest it's still alive at the end of 5 days. So do not take this and run with it and think you're in any danger at the moment. When we look at the Canadian strike probabilities from the Canadian model, we see a much tighter agreement. None of those silly ones that the UK Met had going way out here to Fiji. It's suggesting a little bit more of a southward movement or a south-southwest movement, then a bit of a southeast movement, and then a very fast shift to the west. But at the end of 5 days, you can see that the members that are still suggesting it's alive are all over the place, anywhere from sort of the Brisbane region all the way up to the Townsville area. So it's really not very good in the longer term, but at least we see some agreement now that it is going to push to the south and then eventually curve to the west. When it curves, how fast it curves, all of that still up in the air according to this model. And once again, we'll go back to the but and the if. At the end of 5 days, only 62% of the model members suggest this thing is still alive. 38% suggest it's not. In this model, we see very tight grouping. This is the Global Forecasting or GFS model from NOAA in America, and we see that very tight model agreement of its expected track and very sharp recurvature to the west. Now, interestingly, with this model, it suggests that every single model member has this still a tropical cyclone at the end of 5 days. You can see here that at the end of 5 days, as 100% of the members have this are still tracking this system as it pushes to the west. So this model is very confident in the survival of this particular system throughout the next 5 days. The GFS always tends to overestimate tropical cyclones' intensity and potential, so do take that with a grain of salt. There is likely to be, in the real world, a fair bit of doubt as to whether this system actually does exactly what it's supposed to do at the end of 5 days, and whether it's still alive at the end of 3. Okay, now we're going to track the Euro model and the Euro model ensemble. So because we think today's Euro model is actually a little bit, it's doing some silly things with this system, we're not going to talk about the deterministic Euro model, which is usually the most accurate, because we just feel that it hasn't identified the situation, particularly in days 3 to 5, very well at all. It has this tropical cyclone just sitting there north of New Caledonia for a number of days before eventually pushing southeast. It doesn't seem to have grasped the fact that we've got such strong mid-level ridging coming into the Tasman Sea, and so we're going to stick with the ensemble because the ensemble seems to be a bit smarter tonight. And this is what it looks like at the moment. In 24 hours we start to see not too much disagreement, so the system's still expected to be in that region. In 48 hours we are starting to see a tiny bit of disagreement there, with some of the members starting to push it already to the west in 2 days. Most of them, though, are still in fairly tight agreement of having the system right there. In 3 days' time, on Friday morning, we do start to see a fair bit of disagreement. Now, here's where the model disagrees. Some of them continue to push it out here to the southeast. Some of them have already started the recurve in 3 days, and so that's where we start to see disagreement. Interestingly, we'll also keep an eye up here in the northern parts of the Northern Territory and the Timor Sea. On day 4, on Saturday, we definitely start to see a recurve, and you can see here overall the system recurves. We can see the area of lowest potential pressure in here to the southwest of New Caledonia. Over the top of the top end, we start to see lower pressures on the weekend. As we head into Sunday, we really see a movement fast towards the west now developing. Look at this big high coming in here, 1,025 hectopascals. Now that's going to create a lot of low to mid-level ridging and some fairly strong ridging as it pushes up and comes up and impacts this system as well. So what we're going to see is, as long as the system remains reasonably weak, it's going to push to the west, and it's going to push to the west reasonably rapidly by Sunday. if this model projection comes off, especially with this high being so large and the ensemble members, so strong, and the ensemble members are pretty clear that they want to push a big high in here. Now, also over the Timor Sea, we start to see even bigger area of low pressure, or in fact we see two areas of low pressure, one out here in the southeast Indian Ocean off the Kimberley coast and one up here. So that shows a little bit of model disagreement there by Sunday as to which one of these is going to become the dominant low. And if we head on to Monday, on Monday, the Euro doesn't really want to nut it down to us and help us out any, because it's got a lot of disagreement here still as to how fast. Look, there's very little doubt in the Euro Ensemble that this is going to push to the west, but the pace and speed that it pushes to the west, there is a lot of doubt on. So we've got model members by Monday that keep Tropical Cyclone Freda, or what's left of her, way out here, and we've got others that are pushing her onto the coast already by Monday. So, you know, there's a lot of variability in the guidance, but overall, we can confidently say that the model members that continue to, remember, that's only 70% of them, the model members that continue to keep Freda a tropical cyclone, or at least a strong circulation, continue to push her to the west, and there's very little doubt on that movement. Now over here in the Northern Territory and the Northwest Kimberley, we start to see just generalized areas of low pressure because the model can't specifically pinpoint an area of lowest pressure, and we see these little tiny bits of lowest pressure in those low pressure regions, which suggests maybe these are hotspot potential areas, but still too much disagreement in the models come Tuesday, or come Monday, sorry. And we're only going to go as far as Tuesday, because after that it's really futile looking at things that far ahead. But at Tuesday next week, we've got, you know, this whole Coral Sea area that we do need to watch. We do have this high weakening though, so if the cyclone hasn't hit the coast by Tuesday, say Tuesday night, this high ends up weakening out pretty rapidly on Tuesday. This new ridge doesn't push in time, so there is that option for, if the cyclone hasn't crossed, that it may decide to push back to the southeast again just before crossing. So that's always an option that needs to be kept open if this high does end up weakening. The other option is that as the cyclone approaches the coast, it may slow down, which isn't great news, but remember, we always go to the but and the if. Okay, so there's only 70% of models are suggesting that this is a tropical cyclone at this point in time, so we always go back to that fact. So please understand that out of that, there's still all this variability. Out of the 70% that do have it a cyclone, there's still all this variability in the model guidance. So yes, I've circled parts of the Queensland coast, and yes, there are parts of the Queensland coast that need to be watched for potentially a crossing early next week. But once again, only 70% of models have it even being a cyclone at that point in time. Over the northwest, we see continued just whole areas of low pressure. So in fact, you could probably put a big arc in this area that suggests that this whole region is probably going to come under the influence of some type of monsoonal trough, or being very close to some type of monsoonal trough by that stage next Tuesday, so in about a week's time, maybe a little bit more. So that's as far as we're going to take it. But the Northwest WA and Northern Territory region, we are definitely onto the potential out here, and it's being shown by not just the Euro Ensemble. A lot of different models are starting to show this now. The GFS Ensemble starting to show it, and even some of the Access modeling, which is the BOMS models, they start to show something happening out here as well. So we are definitely keeping an eye on that. But most of all at the moment, we're keeping an eye on Freda, and as I say, 70% of models continue to make this a tropical system, and varying in intensity. So at the moment, Freda, we have variable intensities as it makes its approach to the coast. We have suggestions that it could be as low as 970 hectopascals according to some models, and the outliers at the other end of the scale are 1010 hectopascals. So it goes from just a very weak low all the way to a Cat 3 cyclone. We just have no real idea of how strong it'll be as it makes its way west. So we do need to keep that, factor that in as well. Once again, I go back to the point, and I need to stress this because I know some people will take this and stress out about it. Only 70% of all global computer models have this even being a tropical cyclone this early next week. Okay, now out of that 70%, there's still a number of them that don't even cross the coast with it. So there is a lot of variability, and I'll probably stress that one more time till you're sick of it. But I don't want this to be sensationalised and everyone taking it away and thinking, oh, Nitso said it's going to hit the southeast Queensland coast. That is not what I'm saying. Okay, time to talk MJOs. Now, if you don't know what this is, please Google it. I don't have the time here to explain it all in detail. In the coming 2 weeks, the MJO is likely to strengthen slightly and then maintain moderate strength as it continues east across the maritime continent. Now, that was issued on Tuesday, the 25th of December. Unfortunately, they haven't updated that today. But what we can tell you is that it has done that, and it has actually intensified a little bit, and it is likely to move over Australia over the next 2 weeks from now. And so we're going to see an increase in rainfall. We're going to see likely to see the onset of the monsoon over the next 2 weeks, and we're likely to see increased chances of tropical cyclone development over probably the next 3 to maybe even 4 weeks. This mumbo jumbo is the Bureau of Meteorology's phase diagram using their modelling. It's not very reliable at the moment because look at these outliers. It's going off its tree, so we're not going to use this in our analysis tonight. The Canadian model ensemble is suggesting that the MJO is very close to now Australian longitudes and will explode in intensity over the next 5 to 6 days, and it's being shown by the Canadian model with the explosion of tropical cyclone development over the next 6 days near Australia, particularly off the north coast and west coast. But you can see here very strong signal pushing through phase 4 and 5. Obviously, this is the most accurate model. This is the European model, so we'd be silly not to have a look at this. And you can see here a real explosion of intensity in the MJO over the next 5 to 7 days, and then fairly slow progression through our area. So we're going to see rainfalls, particularly towards the end of next week, when it gets into this peak area, really start to ramp up, and we're going to see probably the onset of the monsoon either late next week or the week after, or middle next week onwards anyway, and then continuing a fairly strong type monsoonal surge or MJO surge into phase 5 till at least the middle of January. So it won't be out of Australia until the end of January, and so we're going to see overall an increase in northern and western parts of Australia, an increase in potential for cyclones and rainfall. And then as we head in towards the middle to later part of January, we're really going to see a big increase in potential rainfall over northeastern parts of Australia and northern parts of Australia. So that's the progression that we're expecting over the course of January. So overall, a very wet January coming up for most of northern Australia. Probably a fairly slow start over the next few days, but really you'll notice the big difference, and you'll notice the big change, particularly if you're in Darwin. You'll notice the big change in the season sometime later next week. So looking at the potential rainfall over the next 10 days, now the scale here is in inches, and so the blue is basically close to an inch, which is 20 mils or more. And the purple's more around 20 to 50 mils. The orange is 50 to 75 mils. The red starts to get above that to 150 mils plus. So we can see over the east parts of Queensland, assuming obviously that the Euro deterministic hasn't actually developed the cyclone and pushed it this way. So these figures are probably much higher than much lower in this map than they're going to be. So we'd expect a lot more rain in this area over the course of the ensemble. But overall, northern parts of Queensland still fairly dry. But as we start to head into the northwestern parts and the northern parts of the territory, we're going to start to see, you can see here, this is where the monsoon trough's going to lie, and it's just not shifting south enough in the next 10 days. But let's have a look what it does after that. So this is courtesy of Weather Zone. We can see that in the 16-day period, once we get, or 14-day period, so once that monsoon trough does start to push a little bit south, we will start to see the onset of some fairly good rainfall here over the northwest parts of the territory, northwest parts of the Kimberley. Still not quite getting into Queensland. It is starting to hit the tip of the Cape, but remember that MJO won't really affect the Queensland region and the Coral Sea region until later in January. So as we head into late January, cyclone potential increases, rainfall will increase dramatically over the northern parts of Queensland and far northern parts of Queensland as we head towards the end of January, as that monsoon trough and the northwesterlies from the monsoon push further to the east. The MJO at the moment is a very slow pattern or slow movement pattern between phases. So it's going to probably sit over a particular region for a while as it drifts over to the east quite slowly. So once you're in that, you're probably going to experience a few days of fairly heavy rain before it pushes past you. So Queensland not quite happening yet to middle of January. Probably in the latter half of January we're going to see rainfalls dramatically increase over Queensland, particularly the far north, and maybe even, depending on the situation, as far south as, say, Cairns or even Townsville. But this is the area we're watching over the course of the next 7 to 10 days, because this is the area really showing potential of a tropical cyclone impact, and this area too showing potential in 7 to 10 days as well. Not quite as much at the moment as the Queensland region, but it is certainly something we need to continue to watch. And over the longer term, we need to start watching the Pilbara, off the Pilbara coast, in the 2-week period. Alright folks, long one tonight. It'll be a long one again tomorrow night. Things are getting interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and make sure that you vote in our poll at the end of this video. That we'll have a new poll up for Freda, asking you what you think Freda will do. Thanks very much for watching. Talk to you tomorrow night.